Good morning, and welcome to us if you are tuning in online. I'm Helen Collis, a senior health reporter at POLITICO, and now we have a discussion on what's missing in Europe when it comes to bringing advanced therapies like cell and gene therapies to patients in Europe. The European Commission's revision of the pharmaceutical legislation will have far-reaching consequences for the development, the access to these types of products known as ATMPs. That includes market exclusivity rewards, both for meeting high unmet medical need and for launching in all EU countries quickly. There are also other measures, such as strengthening rules on a legal exemption that allows hospitals to produce and develop one-off cell and gene therapies for their patients. We'll be taking the pulse on these measures and more, as well as what can be done to really drive up access to ATMPs across the bloc once they're approved. But before we start, a few housekeeping rules. You can ask some questions through the swap card platform by scanning the QR code. And if you're online, you can find the instructions on our event webpage. If you hear something you'd like to chat about online, our hashtag is Politico Healthcare. So, joining me for this discussion on the stage, we have from my left Ilona Rieschel, a quality assessor at the Austrian Medicines and Medical Devices Agency and chair of the Committee of Advanced Therapies at the European Medicines Agency. Martine Pergent, president of the International Patients Association for Primary Immunodeficiencies. Ancila Santos, senior health policy advisor at the European Consumer Organization BUC. And Martin Schulz, Senior Medical Director for Pfizer's gene therapy platform. Thank you for joining us today. Ilona, I'd like to start with you as our regulator on the panel, and indeed chair of the CAT committee in the EMA. Can you outline for us what makes ATMP so different from other medicines when it comes to making a decision on whether they should be approved or not?
Yes, so the ATMPs have unique aspects, such as with cell-based products and even with the viral-based products, that there is very little material to do the analytics on one hand. But then there are multiple issues and challenges that are not per se unique to ATMPs, but also apply to others. But they all apply to ATMPs in combination. So if you think about it, there are challenges because of orphans, there are challenges because of GMOs, there are challenges of complex manufacturing, but all of this comes together in the context of ATMPs, very high unmet medical need, orphan and ultra-orphan situations. So to get a data package in an innovative field that in itself still has uncertainties is probably the biggest challenge, and it requires a very, very close interaction, and that's probably also one unique aspect, an even closer interaction between manufacturing, preclinical and clinical. Mm-hmm. So that's how I...
And we know that for most cell and gene therapies, the clinical data is based on a very small patient population, open label, uncontrolled, single-arm trials. How does the EMA and regulators manage that gap in the evidence for these types of products, especially when the long-term data is so unclear?
Well, first of all, in order for a product to be approved, the benefit risk has to be positive at the time of authorization. So there is no question about that. Otherwise, it doesn't even get approved. But there might be still long-term data requirements that are open. So we have a very extensive post-authorization follow-up, which needs to be agreed and presented at the time of marketing authorization. And depends on the nature of the product and specific aspects of the development. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But I think it's really important to emphasize that at the time of approval, the benefit risk needs to be positive.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Ancila, I'd like to bring you in from the consumer perspective here. We know there's long-term follow-up requirements for these types of products. From your perspective, are there any concerns with these knowledge gaps at the time of approval? And how is it communicated to patients?
Yes, I mean, of course, I agree that the benefit-risk balance has to be positive, but this is also based on the data that you have so far at that moment. You don't have all the answers. And for us, what is very important is that when medicines are approved conditionally, that clearly, like, companies stick also to the timelines when it comes to the post-marketing requirements, because we cannot expect that patients, healthcare professionals, have to live with the remaining uncertainties for too long. And it's also then important to close those gaps for the HTA bodies, the decisions also at some point of pricing reimbursement, because otherwise that's what we see, that sometimes then these therapies are then authorized, but then there are challenges when it comes to reimbursement. First, because the price asked by companies is usually very high, but then there are still like uncertainties, and at the end of the day, this is why it's also, I think, important that at the point of approval, as much as possible, the data is as much as possible robust, let's put it this way, but that then there are clear timelines for compliance with post-marketing requirements, transparency around this, because that's also, as I said, important. We cannot live with uncertainties just for too long.
And Martine, I'd love to get your position on this. You represent patients with hundreds of different immune system deficiencies. Most of them are inherited rare diseases. Does it feel like there is a burden there for the patients to really shoulder that evidence gap, or are they willing to accept that higher risk?
Yeah, first of all, I need to say that many of the rare diseases have no treatment. So when a treatment appears, of course, the parents, because in our case this is mainly about children, but also young adults. Of course, this is an immense hope, and they want to try everything possible so that their child have a chance to survive or be improved by the medicine. So I think that what we need is to ease the access to those therapies, and of course, as close as possible. Meaning that at the time for our condition, for example, we have 1 or 2 places in the EU, but most of the patients need to travel to the US. And this is not, this is an added burden. I would not say it's not bearable, but this is truly an added burden. We need that the EU improves the access to our patients.
And the European Commission wants to encourage the development and improve access to these types of therapies, for which there is a very high unmet medical need in its new proposals. It would encourage this by adding 12 months of market protections for products that meet that threshold. Martine, staying with you, do you think this approach will help to incentivize more drugs to be developed in these many areas where there are no treatments?
Well, I think that, first of all, the legislation needs to be very flexible when it comes to unmet medical needs, or even high unmet medical needs, because science has to go its way, and this is not always being incentivized and also given objectives that this is the best way to develop solutions for science and medical science. So I think that this is a nice idea to begin with, but also the flexibility should be there to allow the current development, but also the future ones, which we not always can forecast.
And Ilona?
Yes, just a very short note to put things in perspective. We talked about long-term follow-up and evidence generation post-marketing authorization. Just to say that it isn't all that easy, because in the rapidly innovating field, if you decide on a post-authorization follow-up, let's say in 2023, the situation might have changed quite profoundly 2 years later. So we talk easily about we are going to have a plan for post-authorization follow-up, but even there we need to have a certain flexibility.
Good point.
That's true.
Martin, yes.
Yeah, no, and just adding to what Ilona said earlier, and for us to be grounded in the science, I think what's different about these therapies is that these are really aiming to address the underlying cause of a genetic disorder with one treatment and potentially transformative long-term effects. So that's quite different from the traditional medicines that we have, like the pill that you take once a day and the biologic that you maybe take once a month. So we have often a single treatment and then a long-term effect, and we need to make sure that of course there's uncertainty. So as been said, we need to make sure that we've got the appropriate structures to collect real-world data. I think sometimes also the structures are really missing. And we also need to make sure that we've got the right policies in place. And this is important for all for all, right? For the patients and the doctors that need to make an informed decision. They need this data, this long-term data. But then, of course, also when we want to speed up regulatory processes, reimbursement, and then last but not least, also when we think about potential innovative payment agreements. I think good quality real-world data is also very important there.
We'll definitely come back to a few of those points in a few minutes. But Martin, sticking with you, I just wanted to get your take on the incentives that have been put forward by the European Commission. I know you don't work on the commercial side of things, but as our industry representative on the panel, can you give us any insight into whether or not Pfizer is reviewing or even reconsidering its ATMP pipelines based on the Commission's proposed incentives package?
So I think, first of all, what's really important when we talk about orphan drugs is that we look back at the orphan legislation that we had, that it was really a big success story. Like when you think 20 years back, we actually had very few drugs for rare disease patients, and I believe now we have over 200 in 90 therapy areas. So I think that's a big success story, and we should just really try and build on that and not undermine that. Of course, there are areas where more can be done. So I'm thinking about ultra-rare diseases with a very low prevalence. So I think additional incentives there will be helpful to stimulate investment in that area and more research. But again, I think it's just very important to have a solid, predictable incentive structure for investment in Europe in these cutting-edge technologies.
And Martin?
Yeah, I would like to highlight that, in fact, I agree on the fact that this is a successful story, but still we can see very many discrepancies between countries within the EU at first. And also, I think that there is a missing piece in the process, which is newborn screening. And this is truly an unmet need. And for many diseases that are treatable, it should be, I think that the EU could support its members in developing such I don't know, medical device or process. Process, sorry.
Ansela, I wanted to also get your position on the European Commission's proposals to really drive the development and uptake of rare disease products. Do you think they will help to improve the situation? Just to set the scene here a little bit, a study published in December last year, so 12 months out of date, really. But it found that there were 19 ATMPs that obtained EU marketing authorization, only 13 of which had translated into clinical practice in some countries, and 6 had been withdrawn from the market. Do you think that the current set of proposals from the Commission will help to improve that situation?
I mean, we support this idea of modulating the incentives and providing a bit more incentives for medicines therapy that meet an unmet medical need that we support. This idea is embedded in general for data market protection, but also for market exclusivities in rare diseases, and we support that. I mean, at the same time, whilst of course it's important to promote innovation and make sure that these products, let's say, are approved, and the companies also get regulatory support from the EMA. That's also embedded in the legislation. Then the next question is, how do we ensure that they reach the patients? And I think here there are 2 challenges, one on availability and one on affordability. I mean, availability, it goes beyond ATMPs, but it's the fact is that even if a company has a marketing authorization by the EMA, they don't have to launch the product in all markets. They don't even have to try to start these negotiations on pricing reimbursement. So I think it is, we definitely support that the legislation includes measures that push companies in that direction, that's for sure. And then on the question of affordability, I mean, here, for example, we support this proposal on increasing transparency about the public contribution to R&D, because we think that that's something that should be factored at the end of the day in the price of the therapy. But we would like to go beyond, and what we argue is that, well, companies that have these incentives, and at the end of the day, are kind of, if you want to call it a monopoly, and that they should be obliged to share comprehensive data on their own investments, R&D costs, with pricing and reimbursement authorities upon request from these authorities. Because we think that this also could help in the negotiations when it comes to deciding, at the end of the day, a fair price. So that's another step forward that we would like the legislation to give. And then on hospital exemptions, I mean, I think that's also supporting that public hospitals and academics can also develop therapies. That's important because they're going to be way more affordable.
Yeah, and we're going to come to hospital exemptions in just a moment, but it's just focusing on the affordability and the pricing issue. We know that one-off gene and cell and gene therapies, or potentially one or two treatments, can be upwards of €1 million per patient. Martin, you head up the gene therapy division at Pfizer. Can you give us an idea of how long it takes to develop a single gene therapy? And can you give us any idea of the costs that are involved in bringing successful gene therapy to market?
Yeah, so again, obviously I'm involved in the medicine and the science of gene therapy and not in the commercial and pricing aspects. And of course, this is an incredibly important topic for the patients and for access, and it is a very challenging topic as well, because we need to think about the value of these therapies quite holistically, I think. What does it mean for the individual patient and the caregiver? What does it mean for the healthcare system, right? If you don't treat a disorder, then you will have the cost for chronic disease management, potentially emergency hospital administrations and what have you. And then there are also additional value elements that I think should be captured. So for example, if many rare diseases affect children, and then often one of the caregivers stops to work just to care for the child. So for this person to go back to work, I think this should also be factored in. So it's a very complex topic, but I think it's important to have a holistic view on the value that these therapies bring.
Mm-hmm. Elena, did you want to come in?
Yes, please. So I'm not involved in pricing per se, but I think what I see is that cost becomes the dominating factor in the discussion. And I find that not appropriate because it needs to be cost versus data supporting the product. Because quite obviously, if you need to generate data, if you need to generate good data, that will bring effort, and effort brings cost. And it is true that those innovative products are driving not only the product, they're also driving the field. Mm-hmm. And that, I think, was the case for the first antibodies equally. So I think that needs to be considered. And from my experience of what I see, if a company needs to contact 10 different points for access and reimbursement per member state, that should also be factored in when we are thinking about how we are reducing the cost. Mm-hmm. At the moment, I feel that ATMPs are trivialized, and it's becoming a discussion of cost at the expense of adequate data support. And I think that is something I see very critical. You can never just argue on the basis of cost. You always need to ask, what are the data supporting these products? Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to ask Martin a bit about the supply chain currently for a patient who would receive a gene therapy in one of Pfizer's products in development in, say, Latvia or any country in Europe. Once a sample is taken from the patient, what happens next? Can it be processed in Europe? I know a lot of companies are still sending samples back to the US for processing before they come back to Europe and are reinserted into the patient. I'm just wondering to what extent we're really trying to make that supply chain local and bring down the costs.
Yeah, well, just to comment on that, I think there are different gene therapies, obviously. So I think what you talk about is ex vivo gene therapy. So you take some cells from a patient, then you modify them in the lab, and then you infuse them back into the patient. So this is not what Pfizer is currently doing. So what we are doing is in vivo gene therapy. We've got very high-tech facilities to produce these in vivo gene therapies, and it takes really 8 to 10 months to produce a gene therapy of that sort.
Elena?
And just a very small addition for those in the audience who are familiar with biotech products. You could assume that a viral gene therapy is sort of like a viral vaccine, but there you just have to get it in your head that the average batch for a viral vaccine supplies hundreds and hundreds of patients. But the stage we're at for the gene therapies, that's probably a number of 10. So even when you think that you can relate existing knowledge, you need to look at the detail whether it's really appropriate to leverage that. And that obviously also then drives cost.
Okay, thank you. And
Yeah, I would like that for some gene therapy, some ATMPs, among them gene therapy, we need also to have specialized centers to do that, because this is not always doable in every single center close by the patients, and we need to therefore ensure that there is an interplay between legislation, including the cross-border health rights, because this is very important for the patient, that they first can travel abroad, but also be followed up when they're back in their country.
One of the things that, I can't remember who it was, someone mentioned hospital exemption earlier, and it's one of the measures set out in the European Commission's proposals for being strengthened under the new legislation. It allows hospitals to produce cell and gene therapies on a one-off basis for patients in their own labs on site. Ilona, starting with you, I'd like to get, from a regulator's perspective, what your view is on hospital exemptions. Do they save lives? Is there any collective data? Do we know anything about the sort of success of these products?
Well, I think the clear answer is no, I don't know. But the first issue is that when we talk about hospital exemption, it means something entirely different in every member state. That's the first complicating issue. Some member states have strict requirements. I don't know about their transparency, but I would assume that they have that. Others have nothing. So I feel that the example of the hospital exemption given is usually the strictest one, which doesn't reflect what's happening in other member states. And the requirements in some member states are really quite minimal.
Okay.
Which relates, and I think for me that's always the key in this innovative field, any treatment that doesn't yield data, usable data for the field in the wider sense, to me is a lost opportunity. And I'm a clinical trial assessor, which trains you to be skeptical. So while I definitely agree that there are hospitals capable of doing an excellent job, I would not generalize that to every hospital. And I also see a certain danger in technological advance, where nowadays, I would say everybody can manufacture a gene therapy, but is that really something we desire, and is that really beneficial for our health system?
Angela, you wanted to come in next?
Yes, I think the Commission proposal goes a bit in that direction. It's about facilitating a bit hospital exemptions, but in a way that they give guarantees, because obviously that's important, patient safety, and the data has to be of quality. And I think the Commission proposal goes in that direction, also by facilitating that there's more data shared with the EMA, so the EMA has a better overview of what's going on in different countries. And we think that that is positive. But then the next step is, okay, you have the hospital exemption, let's say, as a promising therapy. How do we move from there to approval? And right now there is a therapy developed in a hospital in Spain, in Barcelona, hospital clinic, which is part now of the PRIME scheme at EMA. So EMA is also giving recommendations and scientific advice, and they are exploring also how to then move there, because that's the next step. The next step is to get out of the hospital exemption situation for promising therapies and effective, safe therapies that can be made available, and they will be much, much affordable. And that's something that we strongly support.
Martin, you wanted to come in on this. I mean, it sounds like hospital exemption would really, if it had greater oversight, as it's been proposed in the Commission's plans for the EMA to really have greater oversight of this, would that be something that patients would like to see develop more?
I think this exists, and this has been mentioned by Ilona. I think that from the patient perspective, this should never become a routine way to weigh off the condition that makes that the patient will be and keep safe. And this is the danger I could see there. And of course, this is good that this can happen when this is really strictly framed, and as it is possible to transform it into some EMA agreed process.
And Martin?
Yeah, no, I just wanted to add, and I'll state in the beginning that the gene therapies that Pfizer manufactures, they are typically not developed in, or they are not part of the hospital exemption. Like they are developed in, or they are produced in highly specialized facilities, and that's just not possible in a hospital setting. But I still would like to comment, because as I understand the proposal for the new rules, it's for the individual patient where no alternative treatment option is available and where there's a high unmet need. And I think for these patients, it's really important. There's no treatment there. So I think there there it is a possibility. But at the same time, I think patient safety always needs to be paramount in everything that we do. And if there's an approved product, that should be used. And if there's a clinical trial, the clinical trial should be used, because then we generate data for the other patients, for the patient community, for us to learn, and I think that's really relevant.
So it sounds like Pfizer's really quite supportive of the Commission's proposals around hospital exemption. It's strengthening the data and using it as a platform to really learn from.
Yeah, well, I think it's really for these patients, as I said, for individual patients with a high unmet need, where there's no treatment available and no clinical trial. Yes, by all means, I think it's really important for these patients.
Thank you. Did you want to say something?
Yes, no, just about the availability. So, of course, what do we mean by available? Because a treatment that is approved by the EMA, as I said, that is not necessarily available in all member states, either because the company did not even try to launch the product there, or because they cannot pay. So what do we mean by availability? I think that's an important question. And I think that that's something that is linked to the comments about the hospital exemptions. Also, there are sometimes patients that don't respond well to an approved therapy. So I think this is also where there's potential also for hospital exemptions also to provide answers to patients as well.
We've talked about issues with availability, and one of the new regulations that's going to be becoming effective or implemented from 2025 will be the European Health Technology Assessment Regulation. And the first products to go through this EU assessment of added value for these products would be for ATMPs and for cancer drugs. We've already heard about the difficulties for regulators in dealing with data gaps, but it's going to be even harder potentially for HTA assessors across Europe to come to an agreement on how to manage these data gaps. Martin, what's your view of EU HTA and whether it will help to improve access to rare disease therapies?
The view is that at the moment this is quite disseminated. We have not one HTA, and this is quite a burden for everybody, including patients who need to travel, for example. I do think that there is, while the EU could support the way of improving access and availability and affordability by proposing models that would help access to patients, because we are far from that at the moment.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And did you want to come in, Ilona? Sorry.
Briefly.
Yeah.
No, I just from the perspective of the CAT,
Mm-hmm.
I can say that the CAT has been actively engaged as part of UNETA, but there's also been there have been meetings in preparation for the regulation.
Absolutely.
So while the scope is clearly separate, there is an interaction on the goals, and I think that is also one of the roles of the CAT as a scientific committee in collection of expertise on these ATMPs. That is quite essential. So from that perspective, I'm not too happy about the proposal of the regulation to dissolve the CAT. Obviously, as a chair, I can't be expected to be excited about that. That's perfectly clear. But I think, aside from structural aspects, I think the CAT as a committee where ATMP experts of European countries meet, who understand the situation in their country and the field, I think that is an essential role of the CAT, and I think that's a bit uncertain.
Yes, and I wanted to touch on that before, but so do you have any concerns about the proposals as they stand in terms of doing away with the CAT completely? Do you know, has it been discussed with you how it might look in the future? We know there'll be like working groups or, okay.
No, so the concern, structural aspects, I think, are a political strategic decision. I want to focus on the science, and I think, I wouldn't be the chair if I didn't believe in the role of the CAT. The CAT, as an expert committee, is not anchored even as a working group, is not anchored in the legislation. So I've already heard, well, the CAT could be abolished completely, and there's nothing in the legislation that requires a further existence of the CAT in whatever form. At the same time, everybody agrees we're going to have more ATMPs, we need expertise. How is that going to happen? I heard about discussions about ad hoc group meetings. To be honest, that is naive. If you think you can maintain expertise on the basis of ad hoc meetings, it's not going to happen. So while there might be a committee for herbals maintained, there is not going to be a committee for ATMPs. And that is certainly something that maybe needs consideration, because I do think we were talking about hospital exemption, we're talking about clinical trials. Every member state needs a basic expertise of the ATMPs and an understanding of how products reach their markets and to learn from each other. And I don't see any alternative but a cut-like group.
It does seem paradoxical that we've got, like you say, lots of ATMPs on the horizon, on the pipeline, and we're doing away with the Committee on Advanced Therapies, and yet we've got the first ATMPs to go through, the first products to go through EU HTA will be ATMPs as well. Martin, did you want to come in on this?
Yeah, I wanted to add to Ilona's concern on the fact that while we understand that the EMA wants to streamline its organization, sorry, we also are worried on the fact that the patient get a representation and can cast their perspective in the decision making. And so far this is not so clear, and we would like to highlight that we need to be there and be part of the decision making.
Sorry, can I just jump in? For the future, you mean? Because
for the
future.
CAT
the CAT currently has patient and physician representatives. And
yeah, absolutely. No, I'm speaking of the legislation that's coming, for sure.
Going back to the HTA regulation, we found out that there's a special meeting happening today, in fact, organised by the European Commission, and it's hosting a special workshop with the HTA stakeholder network to discuss issues around providing access for ATMPs and oncology products, specifically the topic of our discussion today. Martin, what in your view would be a successful outcome from this kind of meeting? They've got some very difficult challenges ahead of them in finding alignment. What are your hopes for this?
Well, I think the premise of the joint clinical assessment makes a lot of sense. So I think the idea is that you generate clinical data, joint clinical data, European data on one level, and then the countries can use it in their HTA process. I think what is really important is that it really reduces the complexity of the process. So I think there needs to be commitment from countries then to really use this data that has been generated on European level and not ask for lots of additional country data, because honestly, this would slow down the access for patients, and this would just complicate the process.
And in terms of finding the right balance between the endpoints that are required for a regulator's analysis and a HTA analysis, do you know if things are moving in the right direction there for ATMPs? We know we have joint scientific and HTA consultations happening already. How difficult are those discussions to find alignment so that there is only one trial really needed to deliver the evidence both for regulators and for HTAs?
maybe alignment is not the best word, because we are not merging the scope. But we need to understand what the respective other side needs to do, and understand better what the critical issues are. But also, I think one important, again, coming back to the clinical trial stage, we are not approving clinical trials for the later suitability towards marketing authorization. The legal requirement for clinical trial approval is safety of patients and robustness of data, but not suitability for marketing authorization. So we can agree, or HTA and EMA can say this is what we want for reimbursement, but that still will not block the approval of a trial where things are done differently. So it is a question, in my opinion, of putting the information out there so that applicants know early enough what is required and think about how they can achieve this. But I also still think that even getting that information out to the very early stages, we always have this standard phrase of phase 1 pivotal trials. I think uncertainties will remain, and we have to learn to deal with these uncertainties as a system, because even if we catch them very early, HTA will not necessarily get the ideal package of data that they might be looking for.
Yeah.
I wanted to move next to payer models. We know that the costs of bringing these treatments to market or to patients are a big hurdle in Europe. We heard earlier in the summit that the Benelux Alliance, a joint procurement group of northern countries in Europe, had to terminate talks recently with a gene therapy manufacturer for a rare disease because the company was not prepared to make the product available under the proposed reimbursement conditions. However, Benelux has reached deals for 2 other products, which were both ATMPs. Angela, I wanted to ask what your view is on joint procurement for rare disease therapies and cell and gene therapies. Do we need even greater purchasing power than a Benelux group? Do we need it at the EU-wide level?
Yeah, we would really support that, and we've really been calling for having joint procurement agreements at EU level. Obviously voluntary, because I think member states cannot be and will never accept to be forced to enter these processes. But on a voluntary basis, we say, okay, the Commission should facilitate these processes beyond medical countermeasures, because now we have joint procurements, but it's very much focused on, medical countermeasures, cross-border health threats, etc. So we say we should expand these, so also countries can join and negotiate jointly and do joint procurement for, like in the field of rare diseases. I think that would be extremely useful. For then medicine therapies that usually come at the market at very high prices, I think a lot of member states would be interested in taking part of those processes. So definitely that's something that we are asking the Commission to facilitate, and we hope to see that in the future.
How would that work, for example? So if we have a joint procurement of a product for all EU member states, the price that's agreed, surely for some of the smaller countries, would be higher than they could afford, but potentially for the richer countries, it would be quite a nice lower price, potentially, if you average it all out. How would you see it working across the EU?
I think if looking at Benelux, for example, sometimes they have agreed, my understanding is, on price, but sometimes they might agree on, like, the price might be a bit different. So that's a possibility, I think, as well. You don't sometimes have to agree on the same price, but, maybe the price can be adjusted based on the number of patients or different factors. And that's also a possibility. But, I mean, we should have more of these pilots, because I think it's a way to learn and to move forward and to keep fine-tuning them. But I think different options can be considered, I think.
Martin, what's your view on this from the industry's perspective? We're talking about ANSA suggesting a joint procurement, but with tiered pricing, which is something I know that the industry has supported. What's your view on that?
So, yeah, again, I'm not a pricing expert, but I think it's of course very good to think in all directions here. When it comes to joint procurement, I think there are some instances where it can work really well, and maybe that's outside of ATMP. So when you think about a pandemic and all the countries want to provide the vaccine to really large parts of their population, interests are very aligned. I think that's one end of the spectrum where it can work really well. When you think about rare diseases, where you've got different patient numbers in countries, different prevalences, also very different systems across Europe, maybe not the right centers, right? We need centers of excellence that can provide these therapies, and the different needs of the countries might not be very aligned. I think then it can actually slow down the process. So yeah, I think that just needs to be taken into account. Of course, with Benelux, these countries are quite aligned, right? These are quite similar, but we don't see that across the EU, all the EU member states, I believe.
And Martin, do you have a position from the patient's perspective with regards to payment models? Is joint procurement something that the patient groups are in favour of, or different types of models, longer-term models? We know that spreading the cost out over longer periods is sometimes a challenge for countries.
Yeah, for joint procurement, I would agree with Ancela, but this is not possible for every kind of ATMP, because for rare diseases, for example, the number won't make any difference, or a very small one. What is really important, I think, is that we consider the journey of a patient. and the loss that represents not to be treated, well, first diagnosed and then treated. And there, this is not only about medical data, this is also about real life data, including working for the parents, for the child in the future, and things like that. And when we summarize this all, I think that obviously this may be worth considering ATMPs, this is worth. And in addition to that, I think that ATMPs should be supported, but financial and reimbursement models should follow innovation that is aimed at, by ATMPs, because they are lagging behind.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us on the panel this morning. That's all we've got time for. I think we've had a really fascinating discussion. We've heard some responses to the Commission's proposals about unmet medical need and the need for flexibility around letting science go its own way with this model, the need to collect data in a more structured way, especially around hospital exemptions, calls for newborn screening, something potentially that the EU could do to really identify patients in, more uniformly, and some really interesting discussions there around potential payment models that could help improve access to these therapies once they arrive. Thank you. We now have a networking break for 20 minutes. Please be back by 11:50 when we'll have a sponsored presentation before Ashley's next panel on discussing health in a changing climate. Thank you.
This is an age of disruption, of profound revolutionary change.
What we're really asking ministers is to empower the ambassadors.
The only thing that you really push forth is the truth.
You don't see many women represented when it comes to the decisions as to how to handle the pandemic.